So I do think reviewers have a duty to their audience to not misrepresent a book, and I do think this is a quite gross misrepresentation of the book, whether you like the book or not. It actually doesn't really.
Yeah, it was a bad translation.
Wonderfully put, yes. Yeah, I think that's the size of it, actually. We could have cut a lot of time off this podcast if you just said that in the beginning, and I would have been like, oh, all right. Nothing I can add to that.
Morning, everyone, and welcome to the Pleasure of the Text podcast, a shared imaginative space where readers and writers make meaning together. We're your hosts, Shannon and Gareth.
Good morning, Shannon. Long time no see. What have you been up to?
Indeed, it's been a while. What have I been up to?
Yeah.
It's Easter when we're recording this, and we've had a pretty wild Easter. I might have a running joke now for the family. It's all fun and games until a little girl falls off a ladder and gets a huge chunk out of her leg. So we actually had the ambulance come over yesterday. So that was a wild ride. But what about yourself, Gareth?
Yeah, no little girls were injured in my Easter. Not much. No, it's been like a regular weekend. Only my wife Joan hasn't been working for part of it. On Friday, obviously, she had the day off, which was lovely, and we'll have Monday off, which I assume will be even better. But yeah, no, my Easter has been very low key. I mean, I'm not devout, so it's really about chocolate eggs for me, and there's a limit, isn't there, to how many you can have.
Were your chocolate eggs scattered around the house from the Easter bunny, or were they store bought?
It's really hard to say because in a sense, for the past year or so, it seems like everything's scattered around the house where I can't find it. So I'm constantly on a hunt for things like my toothbrush, my pants, and obviously Easter eggs as well. So yeah, no, I'm constantly on the hunt. It's really honed my skills, actually. I'm like a tight spring now, ready to pounce on, anything like my breakfast. I'll pounce on it and grab it before it disappears and I forget what I'm doing. So yeah, it definitely has that feel about it, but I'm not sure that actually there was an egg hunt as such. I think also speaking for our male listeners and viewers, the domestic space is a mysterious one where nothing seems to be where you think it is. The fridge is just like something out of a Mariana Enriquez story, in that you open it up and there just seems to be not darkness but just light and nothing in there. And the beer you were sure you put on that bottom shelf is just not there. So
would you say that they've been disappeared?
They've been disappeared. Yeah. I mean, I'd love it if people would throw not bodies, but bottles at me. That would be wonderful because, I can't find them. So no, it's been pretty exciting. The Easter egg hunt continues all throughout the year.
And
did you enjoy my segue? I thought it was a pretty good one.
Yeah. You've alluded to what we're talking about today, and that is we're reviewing Mariana Enriquez, Our Share of Night, and this has been in our plan for quite some time. We started reading this book during the Christmas period, and now it's Easter. Man, time does fly, especially when you're having fun and reading amazing books. And this one was just fantastic. It's a big whopper of a book. It sits about, was it 700 or 900 pages, Gareth?
Yeah, estimates vary depending on how hyperbolic we're being. I think it's 736 pages, but I have said over 1,000 to people.
Very specific.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on which edition you've got. And I'd encourage people to check out the various cover artworks, which I think they're all delightful. I'd own them all if I could.
Actually, I'll put up an image of the other cover that we have, and it's a kind of has an Asianistic feel about it, a red hand with yellow claws, and it'll appear on the screen now. But I also very much like that image.
Yeah, it reminds me of the kind of pulp cover art you would see in the 60s on horror novels. I think Dennis Wheatley The Devil Rides Out. If no one's read that book, they probably should. It's great. And I think Hammer made a great film version of it. But that sort of art aesthetic is very common to that period in pulp fiction and pulp horror fiction. So I don't know if that's what they were doing or if they were going for a sort of an Oriental vibe, but I certainly got the former vibe. Yeah, biases, who's to say? I quite like the other cover. Obviously, this one has its charms, and it's more accurate in terms of the plot of the book and the description of what happens to Juan's hands. However, I just like the other cover. I just think it's got something. So maybe I'll get the hardback as well. Should mention at this point, we are going to spoil this book. We're going to spoil it to the max, and possibly other books and books that haven't been written yet. We're going to spoil all the books. So if you haven't read this or any other book ever, be warned that spoilers are coming.
And talking about spoilers for all the books that we review, a bit of housekeeping, please like and subscribe. This is not a vanity measure. Something about algorithms and YouTube, it helps allow other people to find the channel when you guys do touch the like, and anyway, it's not my forte to do that, but please do so everyone can enjoy what we're talking about. There's some great stuff on our channel, so check it out. Getting started, we have 736 pages, as Gareth said, and it's broken down into 6 parts, very different parts. And the first section is called The Claws of the Living God, and this starts off in January 1981. And we kind of jump into the story of a man taking his son cross country on a road trip. We don't quite know yet where he's going, but then horrors and thrown bodies ensue of ghosts and scary things and the occult and curses. So that's kind of our beginning as a reader to the story. And then we've got a next section, section 2, called The Left Hand, where we have Dr. Bradford enters the darkness, and we learn a bit more about Dr. Bradford and his association with our main characters. That's January 9, 1983. And then it kind of jumps through Argentina, and in that time there was a dictatorship, I think, and there was a war, people getting disappeared. It was quite horrific. And this kind of continues on until our main character, Jasper, has grown up. And we also talk about the mum as well. And there's a lot of the occult and a lot of horror.
I have a question.
Yes. Yes.
This is not a correction. I don't want anyone to think that, because I have no idea. Is it Jasper or Gasper? I've always read it as Gasper, but I have absolutely no idea how you pronounce the G.
That's a good question. I know with Spanish, a G next to an O is spelt, a G next to a U is spelt, so that's why you say Guzman and Gomez. But I'm not quite sure about G-A.
Guzman and Gomez. They could be a sponsor.
Yeah.
We love Guzman and Gomez around here, don't we?
We love your burritos and nachos.
Let me just have one off screen.
Good question.
Yum, yum. Yes, I will distract our listeners while you're doing this research. The names are actually fascinating in this book. One of the things the book does incredibly well is it makes meaning slippery. Some would not agree that slippery meaning is a good thing. We'll talk about that later. But I actually love how slippery the meaning is. And you have a character, Stephen, who is also Esteban. And I love the way that his name is used, that the two names are used interchangeably. There was a period where I thought, wait, are these two separate characters? Am I getting confused?
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah. And it's a great tiny example of what she's doing with meaning throughout the book. Like you have, she doesn't name things very clearly. They have broad names like the darkness, the order, etc. And my sense of that is that these things take on different shapes. Often when she describes things, she suggests there may be some atmospheric bias. I have a great example of that if you want me to read that while we ponder our Jasper question.
It is Gasper. It is Gasper.
Yes. He can join the ranks of the asthmatics with me. We're all Gaspers deep down. So here's a quote, and this is an example of what I mean. This is from page 129 of 761. Bradford started to add something but stopped. For over 20 years now, he'd behaved the same way towards Juan, with an indifference that disguised his devotion. Juan fell asleep naked on top of the sheets, and, possibly influenced by the air conditioner that cooled the room, he dreamed the darkness was cold and wet. He dreamed of chattering teeth and twisted beings and fields of bodies and forests of hands and the hanged man, strung up by his feet, and the forest, and then he couldn't walk anymore. Walking in the darkness was very difficult. It was like climbing, and there wasn't enough air, Gaspar, and things took on shapes his eyes recognized, but then went back to being broken and inexplicable images. The forest, however, was clear, though so far away and colorless, and in among the trees there was a clear presence, waiting, and piles of skulls, a black river that made no sound. So, it's a powerful image, but it's an image that might be influenced by the air conditioner. And I love that sort of equivocation that happens in the book a lot. These things are not set, they're slippery. And she does it quite a lot in a lot of contexts. And I think there's a very specific reason for that, but we'll talk about that later.
I wish I had some quotes to read out of the book. I'm going to grab my copy.
It's good to have a quote. The book also does things about tying the story into history in very interesting ways. So the idea that the darkness sort of permeates history and that it has been a player potentially in all sorts of contexts, not just in Argentina, but around the world. There's I've got one other quote that isn't related to me smacking other reviewers. And this quote I found very delightful. It's from pages 480 to 481. And it goes like this. Stephen asked Juan if Eddie had ever seen him. I don't know, said Juan. I recovered at your mother's house and he lived there. I spent the nights with Rosario, but she went out during the day and I was alone. I don't remember having sensed someone's presence in the room, but that pain medication is pretty strong, and I spent a lot of hours asleep. You understand why I ask, Stephen said. Ever since he was little, my brother has played this very simple game. He sneaks into houses, into bedrooms at night, and moves things around. Or he does other nonsense, leaves some kind of mark on a wall, a drawing. If there's a garden, he tramples a flower bed. In the morning, the owner of the house sees the things and the little acts of vandalism, but can't understand why someone would do them. Eddie calls them creepy crawlers. Before my mother locked him up, he would do it with some friends he'd managed to make in Mayfair, some really demented people. They've all gone to California now. Which is a reference to Charles Manson. And indeed, the Manson family used to do exactly that. They'd break into houses, move things around, and leave. And that was sort of the beginning of their journey to where they ended up. And I like this idea that these things move around and take on different shapes. I think that's the joy of this book for me.
And Eddie was actually one of my favorite characters, I think, in this novel, and he brought a lot of pieces together. And it really illustrated, so we have a wealthy family living in Argentina, and their wealth, I believe, is coming from old money, so England, essentially. And these people, they have everything. They've got land, they have wealth, they've got time, but they don't have enough time. And what is left when you have everything is immortality to continue your lifespan. And that's kind of where Juan comes into this picture. They've communicated to the god of darkness, and apparently he's going to communicate to them how to continue living. And to find that these mediums, which Juan is, as well as Eddie, they were trying to turn him into a medium so they could use him. The family abused their own son. He turned a little bit psychotic and crazy while they were trying to get this information from the Lord of Darkness. And then Eddie has a pretty horrific ending, but his ending is also the ending of how the novel finishes, which is kind of nice and beautiful, horrific in a way.
Mm. Yeah, it's a very labyrinthine novel, isn't it? I think before I became obsessed with Gaspard/Jasper, you actually telling us the structure of the book. Now might be a good time to go back to that. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's all good. Because I was just thinking, I heard this from another review that we did from Willow, and he noticed a lot of capitalism in this book and, you know, the differences of exploitation that you get in society. And there's a mouth that consumes everything. And I kind of likened it to capitalism, how it kind of consumes everything in its path if you continue down that. And that's kind of the ending that this family experienced. I mean, what else is left to do but be completely consumed? And I suppose, in a sense, if you're in hell, or I don't know if you could explain it in that way, you will continue for eternity, but in suffering. Anyway, that's a bit philosophical, but I'll go back to the structure. I think we talked about Dr. Bradford.
Yeah.
And then part 3 is called The Bad Thing About Empty Houses in Buenos Aires between the years of 1985 to 1986. This is the period when Adela disappears, Juan dies after giving Gaspar a really bad cut. And interestingly, you picked this up and I didn't. Adela and the House was actually a pull-in from another one of her short stories.
Yeah, it was. Let me see if I can find the quote. Oh, yeah. So in there's an excellent article you can find online called Scribes for the Darkness. And it's by Sarah Booker. And she's interviewing Mariana Enriquez and Megan McDowell, Enriquez's translator. McDowell's done all 3 of the books that are currently in English. Enrique says this about Adela. She says, when it comes to Adela, I never wanted the girl, just the house. This being a novel about heritage and ownership, houses were very important. In the second long part, I needed a certain kind of house, a facade for a place that eats you. I realized that I had written it already in a story. Since this was the early stage of the novel, I thought, why don't I bring the girl in too? So I brought both. And Adela opened the novel up a lot in terms of the plot and decisions and even explanations of certain things that happen. But it's not the same character. I just kept the name and the house, but it's a different person. Which is fascinating because they both are missing an arm and the reasons why, or the reasons that Adela gives, are the same. And the similarities are overwhelming. And it's sort of a moot point anyway, but it's interesting that for her, these are just not the same people. Because I would have said 100% they are.
I wonder if they don't feel like the same person to Mariana, because I think there was quite a different, well, not different, there was quite a time difference between the short story that she wrote there and then this novel. So it might be less that Adela is different, but Mariana Enriquez is different in her writing style and what she brings to the table.
Yeah. And of course, you can never really go back when you read stuff you've written in the past. It does feel like it's written by somebody else, so there may be an element of that. You also mentioned Juan's death. I cannot overstate how much I was impressed by his death. It's heroic. But he dies in bed unconscious. And I think it's a rare thing when you can have a character, he doesn't make a great speech, he dies almost as a surprise. We know he's going to die. It's constantly framed that at any point he could die, and he just keeps going on. And then one day he doesn't go on. And you sort of think he's going to wake up, but he doesn't. And yeah, he dies on his back, comatose, but it's an heroic death. And that's because of the structure of the book and all the foreshadowing and the repetition, which is crucial to the book working. And yeah, I thought that was like, I was so stunned that I thought it was such a powerful, heroic death. And yet it's framed in the way that typically people say, I just want to die in a quiet, nondescript way in my sleep on a bed. Goodness, that's a great thing. I think if you're going to, for any writers out there, if you want to see how to use these sort of contrasting ideas and see how one thing can become another thing, this is a great example of that. And one of the highlights of the book for me.
And I felt a deep sadness when he passed away, and which was fascinating to me because Juan was an interesting character. You start off the book kind of understanding, but then there's this struggle in him. I think he was based on Heathcliff. That's what Mariana was attempting to do. He's clearly out there trying to protect his son, but there's a very fine line between forcing someone to go along with this plan and just, I don't know, maybe being so damaged by his own experiences and then trying to use his anger and his abuse to protect Gaspar from further abuse, because he knows how bad Rosario's family is, who was a hugely wealthy family in Argentina. I think they invested in yerba mate plantations.
Yeah, he's an abusive father. There's no two ways around it. He beats Gaspar. And again, it's interesting. You're rooting for him. It's hard to like him as such. It's easy to admire him, I think, whilst feeling sort of uncomfortable about some of that. Again, these sort of contrasts and the way they're woven together, the way tension is maintained between one idea and another is very clever. For me, the Gaspar section, the first Gaspar section, was the bit that really, it's the center of the book. And you might even call it the heart of the book. And it was the section I was most engrossed in, I think, emotionally. And a lot of it is very everyday stuff. Just the minutiae of his life as a boy or an adolescent. And it's quite gripping, I think. I was sad to leave his story. It took me a while to get on board the next section, which I believe is Rosario in England. So.
Indeed. We go back in time now from 1985 back to 1960, and Rosario is Juan's wife. And we kind of find out in the first section that she's also been disappeared by her wealthy family, because the concept here and what Juan is protecting Gaspar from is becoming a medium, becoming the servant of the hand of God. The God of darkness. And I think Rosario's chapter is really important, though at sometimes I found it a bit dragging, because this is when we finally get the insight into the occult, what it is like to be one of these members, to aspire for immortality or this power that comes with the God of darkness. And this is where Eddie comes into the picture as well. And so they go to London and they're studying, they're on high on drugs, and they're just having a great time. But there is a common thread, and it comes in this repetition. You have these mediums always trying to kill the members of the occult, and Eddie was one of the most successful in that. He killed all the children, and I think Rosario and Esteban and Juan were the only survivors, and I can't quite remember why. I think they went out or something, but then in the end you only had these three left and the older generation still to contend with as Gaspar gets older.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that Rosario is a fascinating character because she's quite sympathetic, but if Juan disappeared tomorrow, actually this wouldn't work logically, but would we trust her not to turn her son into the medium? I don't think it's clear that she would.
Well, that was the question he had for Rosario.
Yeah.
Can I trust you to protect our son?
Yeah, and of course when you say that to someone, it is a question. It's never a statement. And yeah, I don't think it's ever clear which way she would have gone.
And I love that contrast, because Rosario is the loving mother, and yet we can't apparently trust her. And then Juan's this abusive father, but we know to the very end that's all he committed his life to, the end of his life, to protecting Gaspar from these forces that were after him. And we get a kind of a sense of the power or the protecting mechanism that he put a hold of Gaspar, and that comes in Section 5, the Zanaratu pit, where we have one of my favorite sections, actually, Olga Gallardo from 1993. So we've got a few years after Gaspar's grown up. He's living with his uncle now, but they've asserted a protective spell, and I feel like it was in his arm because that's where the cut happened, but I could have missed something. Olga is a journalism, and she somehow stumbles upon Adela's story and Gaspar's story while she's researching the Zanaratu pit. And this was part of the rebellious movement that got killed off by guerrillas and soldiers, etc. And this concept of, actually, I'm going to digress here, but one could surmise that this is, in essence, a horror story. We have ghosts, we have evil people, we have Imbuchi, I don't know if I'm saying it in the Spanish way, but and yet the real horror to me is just real life. These people disappeared and they were under this awful dictatorship, and that's what Olga was researching. And then eventually she tries to find Gaspar because she knows Gaspar is still connected to Adela, and she doesn't quite understand the story about how Adela disappeared in a house that, as they described it, and it very much reminded me of House of Leaves. You go inside this house that is bigger on the inside and has strange corridors and rooms, and that the breath, the smell of the mouth consuming everyone. And Olga can't find him. There's this strange magic where she always continuously gets diverted away until Esteban tells her she should stop searching. And again, that connects to the beginning of the story when Juan meets a photographer who's taking images of the disappeared and survivors. There's a sexual scene between them, and it doesn't make sense at the time. It seems to be a digression or gratuitous, as some reviewers could claim. However, that connects so well and so perfectly as we progress to the book of how important that connection piece is. And that's when we kind of figure out that people are slowly able to find Gaspar, that a protection spell is slowly wearing off.
Yeah, the structure of the book is one of its main features. It's really sophisticated. I wonder if the journalist isn't in some ways a sort of an autobiographical figure, because Enrique is a journalist, and I think her preoccupation in the horror field with her short stories. I was thinking about this the other day because my book club was doing Things We Lost in the Fire, and it's interesting because the background within Argentina, there are horrors aplenty. People are sort of, bodies are built into the foundations of Buenos Aires, and you have rivers which are so polluted and oily and sludgy and full of garbage that when people fall into them, they never come up and they just become part of it. She creates these personalized horror stories that I think kind of slap you in the face and make you, because we're so indifferent to the suffering of others, aren't we? We're all just terrible people, I feel it must be said. And, the sort of scope of suffering within the world, it's so large and overwhelming that we hear about things in the news and we're like, that's no good. And then we go looking for Easter eggs. I think the way her stories work is that she kind of slaps you and doesn't let you, and she attaches these personal horrors to these larger real world horrors and forces you to engage with them. And I think it's the power of her short stories that seems to be what she does again and again. I don't think that's what she does in this novel, though. I think she does the opposite, which again, I'm just kicking cans down the road now. We'll talk about once we finish off talking about the structure. But yeah, I think her novel actually operates in the opposite way to her short stories for a very meaningful effect.
Obviously, you've kicked the can down the road. We'll come back to it. I'll just wrap up the sections. The final section is called Black Flowers That Grow in the Sky, and this is between 1987 to 1997. It ends a few years after Olga has been trying to find Gaspar. And this is our ending piece. It's kind of where Gaspar takes charge of his destiny and he realizes that there are people after him and he has to do something about it. Otherwise, it will continue on with him and beyond him. And his solution is that, and we are introduced to places of power in chalk circles with Rosaria, but there are places of power that the medium can go to and enter into. And the house was one example of this. And Gaspar leads all the occult through this labyrinth, through this mouth, through this gut, and they're all eaten alive and there is no one left. And then he ends up saying that he wants to go find Adela, and that's kind of the ending for us. And what do you think about the ending?
The ending for me is the bit I have some reservations about, and it's not the narrative. The narrative is fine, makes a lot of sense. I think it's the pacing. I think having sort of stretched out the scale of her writing so much, the ending felt quick to me, and just a little bit too easy, I suppose, from Gaspar's point of view. I sensed he was going to lead them into a trap when he headed over there, and so he did. And as a reader, I would have liked to feel that it might not work out. I didn't have that feeling. I felt like it was going to work out. For me, it's the only bit of the book. It doesn't ruin the book by any stretch, but it's my one big reservation about the book is that whilst I thought the ending was the right ending, it was quite rushed. It was sort of a Game of Thrones moment where they just they were like, well, we're off to do a Star Wars, so let's just get this over with. And it had that feel. It felt rushed suddenly, and everything else had been so carefully, placed down to create certain effects. I don't know. It's easy to criticize these things. It's got such a big scope, and I suppose there were so few characters left in a way that maybe was quite a difficult thing to resolve. I suppose I would have liked, I think it's Florence. Florence, to me, had a kind of an agelessness that Mercedes didn't have. And I think that actually Florence does make a bit more of an effort to escape than the others. I think she's the one that does. Would have been great, maybe, if she had somehow prevented Gaspar from leaving for a period of time or something of that nature. But it did feel like they were stuffed from the minute he said, well, we'll go into the other place. So that felt a little too easy for me, although the rest of the ending, his search for Adela and his commitment to having a terrible life was quite haunting and I thought worked really well. So it's a minor quibble, but for me that was just felt slightly rushed.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. It was rushed, and I think about it, and the story couldn't have ended in any other way. You had all these markers in place for there to be a happy ending, as happy as an ending could be in this scenario, because it's just also horrific. A bit of background, Florence is Eddie's mum, the one that kills the occult members, and Mercedes is Rosario's mum, so Juan's mother-in-law. And Florence, to me, she did have an agelessness, and if there was going to be a character or people from the occult to have a redemption story, it would have been Florence to me. But she is the one that her and her husband are the ones that turned Eddie into the monster that he is. And I felt like once you tip over a certain point, there's no coming back, because that must mean that you have to face the monster that you are and realize you effed up and you created your son the way he is. So you kind of have to keep going because the end is so close and it's the only thing that has any meaning anymore.
Yeah, I mean, an alternative ending that occurs to me, and I don't know. I mean, it's fun to speculate. I think it would have been interesting if he'd got there and Mercedes was dead. I mean, she was a wreck of a woman. And Florence was still kicking, but senile, and didn't really know what the point of him was anymore. And he led her into the other place anyway, which sounds quite cruel, but because they cast spells, and these spells persist regardless of the spell weaver. And I think there's something quite haunting about the idea that the grand evil is not the people, and all you're left with is a senile old lady who doesn't really know who Gaspar is or what she's doing. I think that would have been interesting, because memory plays a fairly large part in the book. And for me, there would have been something really fascinating about then there being a tension in him about doing this to his grandmother, great aunt. that I think might have been a better ending in some ways. It still works out more or less the same, but that would be...
Or I just thought of something, because there is this motif around hands in a lot of the story. So you have the when the god of darkness enters one, his hands turn black and he grows claws. And then you have the hand of power that they steal from the other place of magic. There's a lot of these hands about everywhere. But he does find Adela once he's led the occult through the mouth, and she's just got a black hand. But besides that, she's completely normal, and he leaves the devil back into the real world. That would have been cool.
Yeah, that would have been a very... that would have set up the sequel.
Oh, yeah. You're welcome, Mariana.
There you
I love
go.
you.
Send your check to this address. So, yeah, the ending maybe wasn't totally satisfying for me personally, and I guess, and for you personally.
And what do you feel about the comments of this being gratuitous?
All novels are somewhat gratuitous. It's their nature. They're full of stuff, and that creates a reality effect. I read a very good review. So when you talk about good and bad reviews, obviously, if the point of whether they're good or bad is whether you agree with them or not, it's a bit meaningless, isn't it? So why I think this is a good review is that it identifies what I think is a key talking point about the book, and considers it in quite a nuanced way. So she's got, it's a couple of paragraphs that I'd like to read to you from this review. It's by Elizabeth Gonzalez James, and her review is "They Toss Bodies at You" on Mariana Enriquez, Our Share of Night. This is for the Los Angeles Review of Books. And these are, I'm going to treat this as one big quote, but I've done some editing. So, as a journalist, Enrique has covered the aftermath of the dictatorship, the cover-ups and betrayals, the ongoing search for answers and closure. So it's no surprise that a fictional work is grounded in this reality. In an essay for Freeman's that was reprinted in Literary Hub, Enrique says there was no tradition of horror in Latin American literature when she was growing up, that horror was entertainment and thus low class. And so when she began writing horror, she had to find inspiration in history. In fact, as Enrique recalls, I asked myself, what were the first written texts, the first horror texts that I had ever read? They were the testimonies of the dictatorship. Bodies disappeared. And she goes on to say, when a book returns again and again to rape, torture, and dismemberment, to teeth filed into sharp points, the horror of it begins to blur, the images losing their impact upon the repetition. Don't get me wrong, Our Share of Night is a remarkable book and one that I hope will influence Latin American literature for a long time, as it shows the heights an author can reach marrying horror to horrifying reality. But I felt that the impact of the bodies, the mutilation, was occasionally lost on me. After putting the book down, I felt like I needed to go look at pictures of flowers or quaint country cottages, anything to get myself out of the depersonalized hell of Enrique's world, where human bodies are so many grains of sand. Perhaps there are only so many horrors I can consume at once. Perhaps I'm sheltered. Perhaps I'm complicit in my urge to turn away. She concludes, unsettling and tragic, poignant and true, Our Share of Night. Do you see how we always link descriptors together in pairs? It's a very common thing. Unsettling and tragic, poignant and true, Our Share of Night is a masterwork from a writer with an unflinching gaze. If you can manage to hold that gaze with her, you will be richly rewarded. And this, I guess, is what I meant about, short stories. She's almost slapping you awake. In this novel, with all its repetition, with all its layering, that is not what's occurring. If anything, she's deadening you to what are sometimes just unbelievable atrocities that she describes. And what we find instead is that we become very invested in the particular. We become very invested in Gaspar being okay. Even, I think, Adela being lost for him somehow seems okay. And I think the book very much contrives to make this the case. And so, yeah, it's the opposite effect And she uses the opposite approach. Instead of having incredibly tight writing, she has much looser writing that is absolutely chock full of repetition and detours and so forth. But I would argue that there are very, very, very few of these things that don't actually reoccur and have meaning and resonance as the book unfolds. I don't think it meanders aimlessly at all. I'm quite astounded that anyone might think that. We're doing some foreshadowing. And the critic in this case sort of blames herself. She says, maybe I'm not tough enough to cope with this book. But I think, in fact, everyone has this reaction at a certain point. I didn't need to go and look at quaint country cottages, try saying that 10 times. But I did notice that I was reading things that were quite shocking, like the torture of very young children, and finding myself not as upset as I would like to think I should be. Same effect as American Psycho. That book, through its repetition, deadens you to the point that you really are surprised with yourself that you're not more bothered. But I think with this one, it's all about really investing the reader in a handful of characters, and particularly in a single character, which is Gaspar. Desperately want him to be okay. Everyone else, it's maybe, but we desperately want him to be okay. And of course, he's not. He's not okay at the end, and I think that is one of that's the powerful bit of the ending, as opposed to his triumph, which. And indeed, you got to wonder if his triumph was more fraught, would that affect the downbeat actual ending? It's hard to say. One imagines things could be different, but maybe they couldn't. Maybe she tried that and it hadn't worked. Hard to say. But I think, James here is looking at the stylistic specificity of this book and seeing something quite nuanced and sophisticated, and her reading is nuanced and sophisticated in my opinion. Any idiot can see that this book is sort of exploded out, full of signifiers, very slow-paced writing. But she sees something in that is useful, and whilst I don't actually agree with her conclusion, I don't think that she was failing to read it correctly. I think she was reading it correctly. It gives you something to think about. So I consider that a very good review, even though in a sense I don't agree with it. It's a very thoughtful review that's actually tried to take the book on its own terms. Did you read that review?
Yeah, I did. And you touched on a couple of points, how we are invested essentially in just Gaspar surviving this experience, and does he really towards the end. But one of the characters, his uncle, who has looked after him through toughness and just horrificness, through night terrors and him stabbing his uncle almost. His uncle is disappeared, and they find him and he has an arm in his stomach. And on a certain level, you are definitely horrified by that. But given the rest of what's already previously happened, it kind of just flitters on your brain, and then you kind of move on to the rest of the story. And that is the same level of horror that happened to Mercedes, one of the evil characters, if you will. And I did find a quote that I did want to read finally. And this is Juan and Mercedes are having a conflict before the end of part 1. Juan pictured Rosario and her silver bracelets, the white band in her hair, speaking Guarani with a fluency that astonished everyone. Rosario with her expensive perfumes and her pen between her teeth when she read, the fan behind her so it would blow on her back instead of her face. Rosario with her lists and her fingers covered in ink or in chalk. Delicately, he drew a circle around Mercedes' mouth, and in his open palm he caught his mother-in-law's lips and teeth. Then he cauterized the wound. Mercedes' screams and those of the caged children were deafening, but he went on with his work. He licked each tooth clean and chewed the lips before Mercedes' bulging eyes. She was no longer suffering because when the wound was closed, the pain disappeared. The scars of the wounds Juan made had never had the tenderness of a recent injury. They were hard and cold. Then he brought Mercedes' face to his and he used his tongue to clean away all the blood on her chin and neck. When he finished, he threw her to the floor.
That's full on, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's a despicable character, but you can't feel this book. You've got to feel a bit sorry for her. I mean, that's a bad deal, isn't it? Yeah.
And you wonder, because in the house that Adela disappears in, there's jars of human teeth and human body parts of all kinds, and Juan gets Gaspar to put his hand into a box that's filled with eyes and eyelashes that tickle him like spiders. There's all these horrific scenes. And then what I find, and it's a great language choice, the word disappeared. So this book is set in, I think it's called the Dirty War, in Argentina. And when you use the word, and I'll read this from a quote, and disappeared thousands of people over the next 7 years. It reminds me of when we started this episode and you were saying how things disappeared around your house and you could find them just randomly. The word disappeared is not strong enough for the horrors that happen in this book of what actually happens to these people dug into these pits and sunk into these rivers and disemboweled and disembodied. It's a great word choice, I think, disappeared.
Oh, it is. And that sort of sense of being removed from things, we come to it as readers pretty naturally because we do ignore horrors as a general rule, and our responsibilities in terms of those horrors. We imagine ourselves quite removed from them. I know I do, but I'm not right in thinking that. But this book, it throws bodies at you. And I think it might be a bit more like the Argentinian experience where you become dead from immersion in horrors. You can't just ignore them. They are part of the fabric of everyday life. And I think it provides but obviously you have your connection to the immediate people in your life. And I feel like she really represents that in this book. And getting across maybe an Argentinian experience, or a bad Argentinian experience. I think the book does that incredibly well. It replaces one kind of deadness that we tend to have, that's sort of underpinned by privilege, and replaces it with another one where it's actually experiencing horrors, or at least the representation of them, that creates another kind of deadness. It's a very different kind of deadness. And these things do stick with you. They sort of come back like ghosts. The stuff about the children in the cages, seemingly I was all right with that as I was reading it. It didn't worry me nearly as much as the dynamics around it and Rosario's obligations and whether she was actually a good person and all those sorts of things.
Because she was feeding them, wasn't she?
She was feeding them, and she was concerned
like
about
animals.
them, but she wasn't freeing them either. And, but those images just start bleeding back into your everyday life. It's like they were beneath the surface and they start floating up.
It is the nature of humans. I was watching a show last night and they were showing a kitten, and they were human enough or humane enough to feed it biscuits and water it. But then the snow came, winter came, and they built a little hut. They would do all these little kindnesses, but not to the point that I will bring this cat home and look after it. There's a certain level that they didn't cross. And I feel that in this book with Rosario.
It is
especially
something that she has a lot in her writing. The first story of Things We Lost in the Fire, The Dirty Kid, talks about that. She does a lot for him, but she never takes him home. She doesn't clean him up. She doesn't actually protect him. She goes out onto the street with him, buys him an ice cream, helps him look for his mother. And she talks about the distinction. And often our good deeds, they seem quite good at the time when we do them, but they're often not as good as they could be. I think that is something. It's a theme in her work that you'll see again and again and again. It's sort of it's a tribal thing, isn't it? We're connected to the people we're connected to, and everyone else is other. And whilst we might feel a degree of empathy for others, it often doesn't translate into much of any real use. So I think she is talking about that because, it sounds hard in Argentina. It sounds very hard.
Mm. And there was another review that you wanted to bring up.
So I'm going to say that, like, with this review that I want to talk about, it's the Guardian review of Our Share of Night. It's by Sam Byers, who is the author of Come Join Our Disease, Perfidious Albion, and Idiopathy. Not familiar with any of these books. I'm not really familiar with him beyond this review. I'm going to say this is a really bad review. And what I mean by that is it's not that I disagree with it, which I pretty much do, but it seems, it's very hard to tell what a person's motivation is, but it seems so off point that I almost feel it's dishonest. I'm going to assume it's not, and that this is Mr. Byers' sincere assessment of the book. But it has some problems. And what I found was reading this review was very useful to me because as he raised objections, I would look into those objections and go, kind of the opposite is true. How fascinating. And I think it's worth going through it. So, I'm going to zip through this fast, though. He begins by saying that in 2017, when Things We Lost in the Fire was translated into English. Is it 2017? She was a compelling new voice for English readers. Tough-edged and tightly honed, her short stories inhabited the space between High Gothic horror and cruel socio-political reality. At its best, her writing had a cool, brutal economy. He gives a quick quote. He then says, in Our Share of Night, her first novel translated into English, set in the decades during and after Argentina's military dictatorship, Enrique ditches the miniature and goes big. Shaping her style to the space, she allows it to go drastically slack. When we first started talking about this book, I think we both had that same impression that I actually think it's apt. It goes drastically slack, or at least it appears to do. And certainly on the level of the sentence, it isn't like her short stories at all, which are extremely tight and economical. But it is trying to do a completely different thing. And the first example he gives of this is when Gaspar's looking for a missing dog. And the quote is, the dog wasn't by the fountain or the pool. So he started checking for her around the trees. There are a lot of them in the park, and Gaspar would have liked to have been able to identify them, to know which was a poplar, which was a laquat. He only recognized the pines. He wished they taught that kind of thing at school instead of about fractions or single-celled organisms. He did well in school because it was easy, but he got bored. He always had. He read on his own. His father could be erratic and he could be scary, but he let Gaspar read whatever he wanted. At the end of that quote, Byers comments, it's not just the bloat that dismays, it's the aimlessness. This is a passage that doesn't so much advance as expand a shapeless, free associative cloud. So there's a couple of things that really alarmed me about that. I mean, the first is that if we read on, he goes through his reading habits and to Dracula and the idea that the dead travel fast, which is a quote from Dracula, I believe. So I'll read you the rest of the quote. Now he was reading Dracula. He had already seen about 10 movie versions, and the book was totally different from them all. One phrase had stuck with him, and now the shiver he felt near the fountain wasn't just because his jacket was lightweight. The phrase seemed terrible to him, for the dead travel fast. He asked his father if he had it. He had a lot of poetry books, and his father, without pausing in his writing or drawing, without looking at him, said no. Is it true, Gaspar had asked, is it true that the dead travel fast? Juan had finally looked up and said simply, some do. Gaspar went running down the steps to the open area with the sculpture of the saber-toothed tiger, then circled the park on the path parallel to Calimita. Vicky and Adela were already waiting at the gazebo near the rose garden. Their faces made it clear that they hadn't found the dog either. So the dead travel fast is a really important idea in this book, and this is the passage that introduces it. So the idea that it's an aimless, free associative cloud, I think, is really problematic, and I don't see how he couldn't know that. But the other thing that really worries me about it is what is he actually wanting the book to do? Now, I've gone looking for things. As you know, everything is lost to me. And obviously, as a writer, I could describe myself lifting cushions and doing this and that and whatever. But in actual fact, when we look for things, our mind tends to wander. A scene of a boy looking for a dog, rather aimlessly, because he doesn't know the dog's in the park. It's just somewhere to start. Would this be the kind of tight, exciting writing that we need to see? And would it actually in any way represent the way such searches occur? Because I've had cats disappear on me, and I'd be extremely invested in finding them and very worried about them. But the mind does wander. In that sort of instance, it wanders to all the ways I should have made it safer for them and harder to get out. But if I was looking for a friend's cat, I wouldn't be thinking any of those things. And I also would not be singularly focused on the search. I just don't think that's natural or normal. So for me, that's the first example of this kind of nitpicking that he does throughout the review. Remember, a 761-page book, and we're saying that this is an example of its fatal flaw. Mm. It's very odd. It's a very odd thing to pick on.
It is. And it discredits the importance of this scene where Gaspar is searching for this dog with his friends, because this is the connection point when he goes to Juan and asks, hey, do you know where the dog is? Because he knows there's something mythical about his dad, and the dad does locate the dog. And when Juan is in hospital, Gaspar is desperately waiting for him to wake up so he can ask his dad, hey, where can I find Adela? But Juan never wakes up. So to discredit this section of the book is just, you seem to have a lack of understanding of the importance of it later on, that repetition that Mariana develops to make each of these pieces work together so well.
Yeah, and you only have to read a paragraph down to see how it all connects up. So that's what I was saying about one doesn't want to question a person's motivations because you can't know them. But it does seem odd that this would be what he'd pick out, because you could just see that there's a problem with this criticism straight away. He then goes on to say, over the course of 736 pages, our Sheriff Knight takes this unstructured direction-free wandering and makes it a governing aesthetic. I won't just keep ripping through this, but this one in particular really kind of concerned me, because I just thought, this can't be honest. A ghostly girl is, quote, covered in trickles of blood or maybe strands of red yarn. So he's making the point that Enrique can't decide what things are, as opposed to them being slippery and meaning changing. She just doesn't know what she wants. So a ghostly girl is covered in trickles of blood or maybe strands of red yarn. Continuing the quote, while Marita yelled at him, he was watching Adela. She's the girl covered in the blood or strands of red yarn, naked in a corner of the apartment, lit by the dusky light shining in from the balcony. Her body was covered in trickles of blood, or maybe strands of red yarn, and she was dancing a childish and elastic dance, her blonde hair falling over her black eyes, black as Amara's eyes and his father's before he died. He tried to look at Marita, but he couldn't stop seeing that little girl body, white and obscene, skipping near the curtain. I think that's an incredibly powerful passage. And the uncertainty about the blood and the red yarn, she's an elastic body. She's almost like a doll. Now, she doesn't say, folks, she's almost like a doll. But I think that is the takeaway one might have. It's certainly what I think is connoted there. And so, again, it seems very odd. He's picked these things out across hundreds of pages. These are the absolute stinkers that he finds. And if you read into them even a little bit, they stop being stinkers. So you sort of think, well, what's the point of this? And so this is the way he concludes. Some might argue that a horror novel, as this aspires to be, should be judged less on the sophistication of its language and more on its ability to thrill. But the narrative is as loosely shaped as its sentences. Enrique isn't alone in trying, through genre convictions, to revivify the big, ambitious literary novel. The problem is that she seems to think that a commercial veneer obviates the need to invest language with life. The result is the worst of both worlds, neither thrills nor poetry, pace nor the pleasure of prose. So, I mean, he does one thing that I think is really unforgivable. He claims to know her motivations. You notice I've been trying not to do that with him as best I can, in spite of the fact that his motivations seem to be screaming off the page. To suggest that she's tried to create a commercial veneer, I would love someone to quantify that for me. What is a commercial veneer? As far as I can tell, if you want to look at an example of a commercial veneer, we could go back to a review of The Well of Loneliness. And one of the decisions made during the writing of that book was to take out scenes that might upset people too much. So I would say that the veneer is an absence more than a presence. I mean, what is a commercial veneer? What does that look like? And how does he know she's doing that?
It seems to me he's trying to say, that she's trying to move away from the world of literature, place the horror aspect on it for sales.
Yeah, and it's quite stunning to me that he sees no poetry or pleasurable prose in the book, and zero thrills as well. It's a hell of a review, and I mean, so this is clearly his personal view, and he's entitled to it. Of course, reviewers are meant to consider the wider audience, as James does in her review, where she says, I had this response. I see what's being done here. Would we all have the same response? Perhaps not. This is not the case in Bayer's world. Its opinion is fact. So when you actually look into this, as one could choose to do, instead of having it's not a review, is it? I'm going to say it's a tanty. It's a printed tantrum. No question about it in my mind. So this is the scope of the novel. This was in that, what was it called again? Scribes for the Darkness interview. It's a fascinating interview. So the question is, I'm interested in the scope of this novel. It's significantly longer than Mariana's shorter fiction. Mariana, how did you use this length to build this world and create such complex narrative layers? And Enrique responds, I needed the length. Some people think there are too many tangents and that it could be less aberrant, but I needed the length to make it believable. The novel is quite crazy. I needed a lot of description, time spent with the characters, even repetition. A long novel can be Hemingway-esque. When the layering started to happen, I gave in and said, let it be long. So I think the length is justified. You know, I'm not the kind of writer or reader that thinks that a book should work. I think that's a totally consumer point of view. I'm going to be pretentious here and say this is art. You should try and experiment and fail, because that's how literature builds itself, not with a nice, pretty, well-done piece on top of the other. It builds with slim, great books and mastodonts and whatever the writer felt was needed to tell the story.
Very different response.
Right, yeah, because you don't know what people's motivations are. And so it's always a little dangerous to speculate. But yeah, I think the Guardian the Guardian does churn up some pretty stinky reviews at times. I often, when I want to sharpen my sense of a thing, I will read Guardian reviews. They have their place, but typically because I disagree with them so strongly. And it's great to have a counter argument, a devil's advocate, we might say, in the context of this book. But yeah, I don't think I've read such a bad review before in terms of its structure and its apparent unwillingness to address the book as it exists. Yeah.
Well, clearly, Sam would give it a 1 star. What would you think? you would give this book?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do think there's a problem with the ending. And I also think that the structure is incredibly clever and sophisticated, but not always that pleasing. I found it very hard to get into Rosario's section. I did. And then I found it even harder to get into Olga's section, which is so much shorter. I sort of appreciated her section when I left it and I saw how it tied into everything. And, there's a thing where basically as good as an idea is, it needs to work in the moment to really be successful. So I don't think it always does. And I don't think Enrique would care that I don't think that, because I don't think, I doubt she really care what I think anyway, but certainly that wasn't her intention as stated. She was happy for it to fail. She wanted to achieve certain things. And the things she did want to achieve in terms of building in, the story is bonkers. And it does feel quite real. And that is because of the repetition and the apparently free associating structure, which is not what it is. But it's a reality effect. And novels do this. Longer novels do this. They have a lot of apparently meaningless information that creates the reality effect. We're not focused as human beings in the way short stories are. It's just not how they work. So when you want to build characters, it can't be super tight. You have to go places with them. You have to go down to the 7-Eleven with them and buy some 2-minute noodles. That's part of getting to know them. So yeah, I don't think the book entirely works, and I could imagine that would be the case for a lot of other readers. So I'm stuck between 4 and 4.5 stars. The scope of it, the scale of it is so impressive, and her handling of so many narrative pieces is extraordinary. It's also worth noting that she doesn't have an established tradition to bounce off as a Latin American writer of horror. And her attempt to create that by pulling areas out of different Gothic traditions and journalism and so forth is a huge achievement. So I'm going to land on 4.5 stars, because I think what she's trying to achieve is so huge that I'm going to give a half a mark for effort. I just think it's such a big project. So I might give it 4 out of 5. I wouldn't give it less. And also because this Byers guy just really annoyed me. So just to be contrary to him, I'm just going to add on that half a mark. I'm saying 4.5 for me.
Mm. There are a lot of moving pieces of this book, as you said. She kind of brings in her journalism background, a very deep history, as well as the horror that we're used to of in her short stories. I would be very similar. I would say a 4. Mariana Enriquez is one of my favorite writers, and I doubt she could have pulled this off. The tightness and her beautiful language that she holds in her short stories. If she could have done this in this, it would have been off the charts. It could have been a 10 stars out of 5. But I disagree with Sam when he calls it aimlessness, but there are a few sections I would have tightened up. There's a lot of when Gaspar is younger and he's with his friends, they're going to university at this stage, I believe. The HIV and AIDS epidemic, and I know she wanted to bring that in because that there was a horror in itself that period, but I did find that a bit aimless and not in keeping with the story. Rosaria also, but I suppose, as you said, when you go to 7-Eleven to get noodles, that's how you know a character, where you learn about a character. When you go to London and get high on drugs and all that, that's how you know about the richness of these families as well.
I agree with you about the HIV stuff. That does feel like it. If you're going to pull out a piece and go, let's just get rid of this bit. That's the only piece. That's one bit you could definitely. And then maybe, if you had to hit 736 pages, you could expand Olga's section a bit, because it did feel
And the ending.
Yeah, and the ending, yeah. But it's such a big book.
And it was one of those books because, and I think this is a point to Mariana, because every character was so different and she does that so well. That's why it was hard to get into each of these chapters, because you've got another body thrown at you essentially that you had to kind of consume to get to the end of this story.
And like the medium, you had to inhabit them. You had to, your consciousness had to jump into theirs. It's never easy, as they say.
Yeah. And she had this ability to, okay, I've changed my mind, 4.5 stars. It's kind of when you're digging into a meal and you're like, oh, I'm not too sure, but you enjoy it. Oh, no, sorry, like exercise. You enjoyed it at the end. Each of her chapters were kind of like that. You had to consume the whole of it before you can enjoy the aspect of the section. Yeah, that's what I want to say on this book. It was really good. And I would read it again.
Also would I. I just want to jump on something you said. I agree 100% with you, actually, but it does sound like the reading experience isn't enjoyable, and that's not true either. I think if one has an anxiety about where the story's going, that might be an issue. But if you allow yourself just to be in the moment, which is always the best way to read, page to page, it's engrossing. It's not.
Definitely.
Yeah, I agree though that when you get past each section, its meaning becomes bigger and more sophisticated as you go into the next section and things wind around.
And that's that layering aspect.
Yeah, it's incredibly sophisticated. I can't imagine anyone ever saying it isn't that, but there you go. So 4.5 for us both.
It's kind of like Japanese souffle pancakes.
Oh my, that does sound sophisticated. Maybe one podcast you should cook one of those whilst we're talking about something. Yeah, we could have a sort of a cook-off.
A mix between.
Yeah, like just add a little wine to this conversation. Yeah. I'd be like Keith Floyd and I'd drink half the bottle whilst using the other half in the cooking.
And I think you want to talk about the book you wanted to bring up in our next book review.
Yeah, so it's a hard act to follow, it must be said. And my original idea was for us to read The Stranger / The Outsider by Albert Camus, because there are 5 English translations of that book, and they are quite different from each other. I thought it'd be and of course he also wrote A Happy Death, which was like a first imagining of the story. However, then I started thinking, so I'm asking Shannon to read 6 books and compare and contrast, and that did suddenly seem like, I need to sleep more. So I had a second thought, which is another writer we very much love, Stanislav Lem, Solaris. Now, Solaris is interesting. It's I guess it's Lem's most famous work. And there's been 2 film adaptations, which get praised and criticized in equal part, sometimes with some really interesting ideas. I would recommend both films to our listeners. There's also I think it's a Polish TV movie that precedes both. Very hard to find, but you can. And that's also very interesting. However, we're not going to do a book into film thing. That's not the translation we're thinking about. What's interesting about Solaris is Solaris was, for English readers, it was initially translated into French and then from French into English. So it was never a direct translation. And apparently Lem was very unhappy with the translation into the French. So because it took out all the humor that's in the book. And certainly Solaris is a haunting, sad book. That's been my experience of it. However, that's not the book he wrote. And you're never going to get that book in translation. However, there was a translation done, I believe, in 2011 by Bill Johnston, I think his name was, and he translated it directly from Polish into English. And from what I've read, the feeling is that Lem would have been very pleased with this translation, that it maintained a lot of the humor. And there's a lot of humor in Lem's writing, a lot of black humor. He had a tough time in Poland during the war and almost died, and got a first-hand look at evil and its banality. So he has a sort of a gallows humor that's sort of in his work, and it's a great feature of his work. I love Solaris. I love it. The translation that he thought was not very good. And I have never read the Polish to English, so I think this would be a fascinating thing for us to do, to compare and contrast these two books and to ask the question, does it have to be what the author wanted? Because again, reading and writing is a space which we inhabit together, and collaboration is a necessary part of the literary world. So I guess that would be the sort of secondary question built into a review of Solaris 1 and 2, to ask ourselves, does it matter as well if it's a faithful translation or not? I think that would be a fascinating book review for next time.
Okay, so we have 2 books to read.
Not 6, just 2.
Solaris and Solaris. Yeah. Just 2. And what I'm kind of hearing is if you're an A+ student, you're also going to watch the movies.
Yeah.
To see how the different translations from a book to a movie, on the difference of directors and producers even. Okay, we've got a very busy month ahead of us to get this done. And I haven't read Solaris yet, so I was going to actually read the Polish to English version first and then go back the other way.
That's clever. And
then we can come back to the table with 2 different lenses, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that'll be very interesting. And there are certainly elements of Lem's work that couldn't be miscommunicated. They're such powerful features of his writing. They would have to be present in any translation. And those ones, it'll be interesting to see if it matters, particularly if other elements are different.
But in any case, my coffee is wearing off. I have Easter celebrations to continue. And happy Easter, everyone, whether you celebrate or not. I hope you've had a relaxing public holiday. Get to work. Even though we are reading 2 books, it is a lot shorter, I would say, than Mariana Enriquez. Thank you. So, and then movies are also fun to watch. Oh, yeah. So, I would say it's a quarter. I mean, if you've committed to the hard slog of Mariana Enriquez, Our Share of Night, you can definitely do 2 books, Solaris, and be thankful that it's not 6.
Right? Yes. Oh, and a note that the Polish to English translation is not available in hard copy. It has only ever been available as an ebook.
Oh, yes.
So if you go looking for it in hard copy, you will be disappointed.
Well, we'll see you all next time at the Pleasure of the Text, and happy reading, everyone, and happy Easter.
See you next time.